For each task, you will be given a short period of time to prepare your response. To most closely simulate actual test conditions, you will need to pause and restart the audio CD as instructed in the following pages. Note to students: if possible, record your responses or have someone proficient in English listen to your response. Compare your responses with the samples at the end of the test. Speaking 1. Describe an academic subject that interests you, and explain why you find the subject interesting. Include details and examples to support your explanation. 19. TOEFL IBT Practice Test 545. Preparation time, 15 seconds. Response time, 45 seconds. Speaking 2. Some universities have large, lecture-based classes, whereas others have smaller, discussion-based classes. Which do you think is better and why? Include details and reasons to support your position. Speaking 3. Please play track 30 on the accompanying CD. Narrator: now read the passage about birds of prey. You have 45 seconds to read the passage. Begin reading now. Stop CD for 45 seconds. 5:46 Cracking the TOEFL IBT. Preparation time, 15 seconds. Response time, 45 seconds. Reading time, 45 seconds. Birds of prey. Many people assume that raptor is the word properly used to designate all birds of prey. In fact, raptors are a group with 3 basic traits that many flesh-eating birds do not share. First, a raptor has strong feet and claws that it uses to capture prey. Second, a raptor has well-developed eyesight. This facilitates hunting from the air. Finally, a raptor has a hooked or curved beak for tearing flesh. Restart audio CD. Narrator: now listen to part of a lecture on this topic given in a biology class. 19. TOEFL IBT Practice Test 547. The professor discussed the characteristics of 2 kinds of birds of prey. On the basis of these characteristics, explain whether either bird would be categorized as a raptor. Speaking 4. Please play track 31 on the accompanying CD. Narrator: the College of Arts and Sciences at Eastern University has decided to add a senior project to its existing graduation requirements. The campus newspaper printed the following report about the announcement of the new requirement. You have 45 seconds to read the report. Begin reading now. Stop CD for 45 seconds. 548 Cracking the TOEFL IBT. Preparation time, 30 seconds. Response time, 60 seconds. Reading time, 45 seconds. The College of Arts and Sciences has announced that it will require students to write a senior thesis to qualify for graduation, beginning with students who enter the university this coming fall. The senior thesis is currently an option in all departments. Specific criteria have not yet been released by the dean, but they are expected to define the thesis as a year-long research project, undertaken with the guidance of a faculty advisor, that results in a paper of at least 50 pages or the equivalent. Restart audio CD. Narrator: now listen to 2 students as they discuss the report. 19. TOEFL IBT Practice Test 549,550. Cracking the TOEFL IBT. The woman explains her opinion of the announcement made by the College of Arts and Sciences. State her opinion, and explain the reasons she gives for holding that opinion. Preparation time, 30 seconds. Response time, 60 seconds. Speaking 5. Please play track 32 on the accompanying CD. Narrator: now listen to a conversation between 2 students. Now get ready to answer the question. 19. TOEFL IBT Practice Test 551. The speakers discuss 2 possible solutions for the woman's problem. Describe the problem. Then state which of the 2 solutions you prefer, and explain why. Speaking 6. Please play track 33 on the accompanying CD. Narrator: now listen to part of a lecture in a history class. 552 Cracking the TOEFL IBT. Preparation time, 20 seconds. Response time, 60 seconds. Now get ready to answer the question. Using points and examples from the top, explain the 2 possible ways early humans discovered how to use fire to release copper from solid rock. 19. TOEFL IBT Practice Test 553. Preparation time, 20 seconds. Response time, 60 seconds. The writing section. This section measures your ability to communicate in an academic environment. There are 2 writing tasks. The first task asks you to read a passage, listen to a lecture, and respond. You will answer the second question based on your own knowledge and experience. To most closely simulate actual test conditions, you will need to pause and restart the audio CD as instructed throughout this section. Writing 1 directions. You will have 20 minutes to plan and write your response. The break between the reading and lecture is not timed on the CD, because some students may need to practice untimed. Therefore, you will need to stop the CD for the duration of the break. You have 3 minutes to read the selection. Please play track 34 on the accompanying CD. Narrator. Now read the passage about the suppression of forest fires. You have 3 minutes to read the passage. Begin reading now. Stop CD for 3 minutes. 554 Cracking the TOEFL IBT Wilderness management has advanced greatly over the last century, due in part to such practices as the suppression of forest fires and limitations on the clear-cutting of trees. Monitoring forests for small brush fires is easier with aircraft, as is the use of large amounts of water and sophisticated chemical fire extinguishers to prevent fires from spreading. The goals of decreasing the amount of destruction by fires and cutting are wide-ranging. One is simply the longer lives and improved health of trees. In some areas of hickory and oak forest on the eastern seaboard, fire suppression has allowed the maturation of so many trees that the treetops form a continuous canopy. There is evidence of the healthful effects of fire suppression closer to the ground as well. Vines and low bushes that would be burned out in a forest fire can flourish when fires are suppressed, of course, but there is a more indirect way fires harm plant life. Chemical tests on areas that have recently experienced forest fires demonstrate that burning decreases the overall amount of nutrients in the soil. Suppressing fires prevents such a decrease. Ferns, wildflowers, and herbs grow without disturbance. Finally, wildlife can benefit. In the eastern hickory and oak forests, the suppression of fires has meant that forest animals, ranging from small insects and birds to large deer and bears, are not burned to death. Deer populations, in particular, have increased notably. 19. TOEFL IBT Practice Test 555 Restart Audio CD. Narrator. Now listen to part of a lecture on the topic you just read about. Now get ready to answer the question. You may use your notes to help you answer. 556 I Cracking the TOEFL IBT Directions. You have 20 minutes to plan and write your response. Your response will be graded on the quality of your writing and on how well your response presents the points in the lecture and their relationship to the reading passage. Typically, an effective response will be 150 to 225 words. Question. Summarize the points made in the lecture you just heard, explaining how they cast doubt on the contents of the reading. You may refer to the passage as you write. Wilderness management has advanced greatly over the last century, due in part to such practices as the suppression of forest fires and limitations on the clear-cutting of trees. Monitoring forests for small brush fires is easier with aircraft, as is the use of large amounts of water and sophisticated chemical fire extinguishers to prevent fires from spreading. The goals of decreasing the amount of destruction by fires and cutting are wide-ranging. One is simply the longer lives and improved health of trees. In some areas of hickory and oak forest on the eastern seaboard, fire suppression has allowed the maturation of so many trees that the treetops form a continuous canopy. There is evidence of the healthful effects of fire suppression closer to the ground as well. Vines and low bushes that would be burned out in a forest fire can flourish when fires are suppressed, of course, but there is a more indirect way fires harm plant life. Chemical tests on areas that have recently experienced forest fires demonstrate that burning decreases the overall amount of nutrients in the soil. Suppressing fires prevents such a decrease. Ferns, wildflowers, and herbs grow without disturbance. Finally, wildlife can benefit. In the eastern hickory and oak forests, the suppression of fires has meant that forest animals, ranging from small insects and birds to large deer and bears, are not burned to death. Deer populations, in particular, have increased notably. 19. TOEFL IBT Practice Test 557. 558 I Cracking the TOEFL IBT Writing 2. Directions. For this task, you will write an essay in which you state, explain, and support your position on an issue. You have 30 minutes to plan and write your essay. Question. Do you agree or disagree with the following statement? A university education should be provided free of charge to all interested scholars. Use examples and reasons to support your position. 19. TOEFL IBT Practice Test 559. 560 Cracking the TOEFL IBT. Chapter 20 Practice Test Answer Key Reading Listening 1. CI, B2, A2, B, D3, C3, C4, B4, A5, D5, B6, D6, B7, A7, C8, C8, B9, D9, A10, B10, B11, A11, D12, C explanations 12, C13, C13, A14, C14, C15, B15, B16, A16, D17, C17, C explanations 18, B18, C19, B19, D20, B20, A21, C21, A, B, D22, A22, B23, D23, C24, D24, D25, C explanations 25, C26, B26, A27, A27, D28, D28, B29, C29, D30, D30, D31, C31, A32, B32, A, B33, D33, B34, A34, C35, D36, A, C explanations 37, C explanations 38, C explanations. Speaking and writing. Because the speaking and writing section questions are not multiple choice, see the explanations in the next chapter for examples of how these questions may be answered. 562 Cracking the TOEFL IBT. Chapter 21 Practice Test Answers and Explanations. The reading section. The number one rule to remember in the reading section is that if the information in the answer choice is not provided in the text, that answer choice is not correct. Please read the following explanations for more information. Reading passage number 1. The veneration of trees 1. See refer back to the first paragraph for the answer to this question. The text says, "It was not a great mental leap for people to see the trees that populated them as embodiments of the natural forces that governed their lives." Choice C is the only choice close in meaning to these lines. Here's why the other choices are incorrect. Fortunately, neither A nor B is mentioned at all in this paragraph. Choice D is a trap. Although the paragraph does say that the veneration of trees united people, this is not how people viewed the trees. 2. Here is the line in question. The woods that covered large areas of Europe and North America, particularly, were difficult to underscore and dangerous to cross. Look for an answer that refers to woods that are dangerous to cross. Enter is closest in meaning to cross. The other answer choices are not close in meaning to the word cross. 3. See this question asks, right as the author mentioned Druids. Go back to the second paragraph and read the lines about Druids. It is known that both the Celtic and the Germanic tribes that inhabited ancient northern Europe regarded certain trees as sacred, setting them apart by species as the Druids worshipped oaks. These lines tell you that the Druids worshipped oaks, which is what C states. Here's why the other answer choices are incorrect. Eliminate A because the author has not introduced the other two stages yet. And B and D are not mentioned in relationship to Druids. 4. B. Look at the lines referred to in the question for a clue to the answer. These taboos were taken very seriously. In some places, one could be punished for injuring the bark of a tree or stealing its fruit. According to these lines, the taboos were taken seriously. Therefore, the word you need in the blank should mean seriously. Choice B is best. Here's why the other answer choices are incorrect. There is no mention of how often the punishment took place, so eliminate A and C, both of which pertain to time. Also, the lines do not say that the punishment was secret, so eliminate D. 564 Cracking the TOEFL IBT 5. D. For a not question, return to the passage and look for evidence for each answer. If you're having trouble figuring out where to look, remember that the questions appear roughly in the sequence of the passage. Here's each answer choice, with the corresponding lines of text that contradict each choice, thereby eliminating them. A. Before a tree was felled for human use, woodcutters in many world cultures would offer it both apologies and thanks for the resources it was about to provide them. B. In some places, one could be punished severely for injuring the bark of a tree or stealing its fruit. C. In some societies, it was claimed that trees cry out in pain when struck or cut into. D. This information is not in the passage, so this is the correct answer. 6. D. This question asks, what is the distinction in the second stage of tree worship? That means the answer is where the passage discusses the second stage of tree worship. Here are the lines you need. It is not bound to a single tree but rather stands for a group. The distinction may seem small, but it is a significant first step toward symbolic thinking. These lines say that the distinction is not a single tree, but a group, which is a paraphrase of D. The other choices are not mentioned as a distinction in the paragraph. 7. Once again, you need to look at the lines around the shaded word and look for a clue to its meaning. Take a look at these lines. The same spirit may thus take up residence in any tree of a forest. It is not killed when an individual tree is cut down. It is not bound to a single tree but rather stands for a group. These lines say that the spirit does not take up residence in a single tree. This is the type of word you need for the answer. Therefore, limited to a makes sense with a single tree. Here's why the other choices are incorrect. Although B may be tempting, it's a trap. The lines do not say that the spirit is hidden inside the tree. Choices C and D do not have this meaning, so eliminate them. 8. C with questions that seem confusing, remember to break them down to the basics. The question asks, why does the author use this phrase? Return to the passage to see these lines. To think about a tree spirit identified with the forest as a whole, therefore, people had to think about phenomena that were removed from them in time and space, ideas rather than things. Such a tree spirit represented the potential and abstract rather than the concrete and immediate. These lines tell you that people had to think of things that were removed from them in time and space. The spirits also represent the potential and abstract. Both these lines point to C as the answer. Here's why the other choices are incorrect. These lines do not mention danger, so eliminate A. Similarly, these lines do not say the people stopped fearing the forest, so B is incorrect. Choice D is extreme and also not mentioned. 21. Practice test answers and explanations 565-9. D. This is an inference question, meaning that you have to figure out what the author is trying to say based on clues in the passage. Inference questions tend to be a bit more difficult than other types of questions, so if you're pressed for time, skip it and come back to it later. The question is asking us about the most complex phase of tree worship. Look in the last paragraph, where the author talks about complexity. Here are the appropriate lines. Liberated from each other, trees and their spirits can begin to be seen as symbols and embodiments of other natural processes of significance to primitive life, the power of weather and seasons to produce good or bad harvests, the mysteries of childbirth and disease. At that point, the veneration of trees reaches its stage of greatest complexity. Also, later in the paragraph, it states, the appearance of these beliefs indicates that a society has made its first steps toward symbolic and abstract thinking. Thus, D, which talks of trees as symbols, is best. Here's why the other choices are incorrect. Eliminate A because it is extreme. There is no information about all trees provided. Male and female tree spirits are not mentioned, so B must be wrong. And no evidence is offered about different ceremonies for different seasons, so eliminate C. 10. B. Read the following sentence for the clue to this question. Societies in both Eastern Europe and the South Pacific presented ceremonial offerings to trees in the hopes that they would furnish rain and sunshine. This says that the societies presented offerings to the trees. Thus, you should look for a word that is similar in meaning to this. The best match is B. Here's why the other choices are incorrect. Choice A doesn't make sense in this sentence. Choices C and D are the opposite of what we need. 11. A return to paragraph 5 for the answer to this question. It may be best to use PO on the answer choices. The second answer refers to the 3 stages of a tree. But the paragraph is about the third stage of the people's beliefs, not the tree. So eliminate B. Choice C talks about trees that require little rain or sun. But the only mention of rain and sunshine states that people ask trees to provide rain and sunshine. Therefore, C is wrong. The final answer choice mentions trees raised by women. The paragraph says that women embraced trees, but it doesn't say they raised them. Thus, A is the correct choice, since paragraph 5 talks about the fruitfulness of trees. 12. From the previous question and any active reading you've done, you may have noted that the main idea of the passage is the 3 stages of tree veneration. Here are summaries of the main points. 3 basic levels of tree worship can be observed in the Golden Bough. Some societies believed each tree had an individual spirit, the way a human being has a distinct mind. 566 Cracking the TOEFL IBT. Certain peoples came to believe that tree spirits were independent of individual trees and instead represented a whole forest. A basis for abstract thinking was achieved when tree spirits were believed to control natural forces such as crops and human fertility. Here's why the other choices are incorrect. It was forbidden to cut down certain trees because they would be seriously offended by an injury, is wrong because it mentions only a detail about one of the stages. More is known about the ceremonies of Europe than about the ceremonies of North America and the South Pacific, is wrong because it talks about ceremonies, not stages of belief. Ancient Germans believed certain groves were sacred and used them as temples, but Druids venerated the oak tree in particular, is also a specific detail that is mentioned only once in the passage. Reading passage number 2, Mercury pollution 13. See applied means, made use of, and in this context refers to heat being used to transform the mercury to a vapor. Therefore, used is closest to the meaning of applied. 14. See the passage states that the largest sources of mercury pollution in the United States are coal-fired power plants. Therefore, C is correct. 15. B. According to the passage, phytoplankton feed on the organic matter in sediments and absorb the methyl mercury. Then, fish eat the phytoplankton. Therefore, B is correct because it provides the link. 16. A concentrated means, made less dilute, as in a solution or mixture, and is used in this context to describe how the mercury becomes more prevalent as it moves up the food chain. Therefore, clustered is the closest to the meaning of concentrated. 17. See the passage credits the U.S. Clean Air Act with aiding in the decline of mercury pollution levels. Therefore, C is the best choice. Choices A and D are opposites often formation implied by the passage. Choice B is not only beyond what can be inferred but also makes very little logical sense. 18. B. The passage states, it is important to note that, thanks to the U.S. Clean Air Act and efforts by industry to curb unnecessary discharges as well as better sewage treatment methods, the levels have been in slow decline since the 1970s. Choices A, C, and D are all mentioned in the passage, so the answer is B. 19. B. The passage states, most methylation takes place in coastal areas. Therefore, B is the best choice. 20. B. In context, its refers to the methyl mercury in the previous sentence. Therefore, B is the correct answer. 21. Practice test answers and explanations 567-21. See the paragraph states, scientists have made a positive link to mercury concentration in eggs which exceeds the concentrations found to be toxic. Therefore, C is correct. 22. The paragraph states that, it is this very interconnectivity that makes our ecosystem so vulnerable. Thus, the interconnectivity is the reason why the ecosystems are susceptible to pollution as described in A. Choices B and D are incorrect because the interconnectivity is not the cause of the mercury pollution nor is it the cure for the pollution. Cross out C because methyl mercury is harmful long before it comes in contact with an interconnected ecosystem. 23. D. Ameliorate means to make or become better, more bearable, or more satisfactory and is used in this context to describe improving the environment by reducing the impact of mercury. Therefore, lessen is closest to the meaning of ameliorate. 24. D. The statement about the long-term impact of mercury pollution best goes after the findings have been thoroughly explained and before the paragraph is summarized. Therefore, D has the correct placement. 25. The most important sentences in this passage about the dangers of mercury are, air currents carry mercury particles far from the source and are capable of polluting bodies of water thousands of miles away. Mercury is transformed into the toxic methyl mercury and moves up the food chain to cause harm for organisms at every level all the way up to humans. The harmful effects of methyl mercury are passed from adult to young and will impact the health of many species for years to come. Here's why the other choices are incorrect. The top right choice, mercury pollution is increasing in the United States despite the U.S. Clean Air Act and efforts of industry, is too detailed to be a main idea. The choice on the right side of the middle line, the methyl mercury binds to the protein in fish, residing in the muscle, is also wildly specific, not a good response to a main idea question. The lower left choice, sulfate reducing bacteria cause the rotten egg smell that exists at coastal areas during low tide, is also extremely specific and not a high-level response, so eliminate that one, too. Reading passage number 3. Hormones in the body 26. B. This vocabulary in context question refers to the lines below. Until the beginning of the 20th century, the nervous system was thought to control all communication within the body and the resulting integration of behavior. These impulses were thought to be the engine for thought, emotion, movement, and internal processes such as digestion. 568 Cracking the TOEFL IBT. These lines make it clear that the nervous system was believed to control all communication. We need a word that shows that all things are connected to the nervous system. Choice B is the only match. Here's why the other choices are incorrect. Choices A and C don't make sense. Choice D is contradicted by the lines stating that the nervous system is electrical, not chemical. 27. A look at the following lines. From the small intestine, secretin travels through the bloodstream to the pancreas. There, underscore, stimulates the release of digestive chemicals. The shaded word refers to the noun that stimulates the release of chemicals. That can only be secretin, A. Here's why the other answer choices are incorrect. The small intestine, B, doesn't stimulate the release of chemicals, nor does the pancreas, D. The secretin does travel through the bloodstream, C, but the bloodstream doesn't release chemicals. 28. D. This is another vocabulary in context question. Go back to the text to find the key lines. Bayliss and Starling showed that it could occur through chemicals alone. This discovery underscore, Starling to coin the term hormone to refer to secretin. Try to put in your own word for the blank. The discovery resulted in a new word. This makes D the best choice. Here's why the other choices are incorrect. There is nothing in the sentence about memory, so eliminate A. The lines do not say that Starling was surprised, so B is out. Invented in C may refer to the new word hormone, but the blank is referring to what Starling did. 29. C used the word hormone to lead you to the correct answer. The author states, this discovery spurred Starling to coin the term hormone to refer to secretin, taking it from the Greek word hormon, meaning to excite, or to set in motion. A hormone is a chemical produced by one tissue to make things happen elsewhere. Thus, a hormone is something that makes things happen elsewhere, which means the same thing as C. Here's why the other choices are incorrect. Choice A is not part of the definition of a hormone. Choice B is partially correct, but the problem is that it refers only to the nervous system. The definition of hormone in the passage does not mention attitudes and behavior, so D is wrong. 30. D. This question wants to know how the hormones are categorized. The answer is in the following lines. As more hormones were discovered, they were categorized, primarily according to the process by which they operated on the body. Some glands which make up the endocrine system secrete hormones directly into the bloodstream. The exocrine. 21. Practice test answers and explanations. 569 System consists of organs and glands that produce substances that are used outside the bloodstream, primarily for digestion. It appears that the main difference is whether the hormones are dispensed into the bloodstream or not, which is what D states. Here's why the other choices are incorrect. The issue is not whether scientists understand the function or not, as in A. The passage doesn't talk about how frequently the hormones work, so B is wrong. The aging process, the subject of C, is not mentioned at all. 31. C. You need to look at these lines to answer this question. Some play such underscore roles in regulating bodily processes or behavior that their absence would cause immediate death. It says that without the hormones, the result could be immediate death. That means the hormones are very important. Choice C is the best match, whereas none of the other choices is close. 32. B. This question is tougher because you have to pay attention to a keyword, minute. The passage states, even underscore amounts of the right chemicals can suppress appetite, calm aggression, and change the attitude of a parent toward a child. The sentence describes some very powerful effects, calming aggression, changing attitudes, and the word even means that we need something opposite of these major changes. B. Small comes closest to the opposite of major. Here's why the other choices are incorrect. Choice A, sudden, is not the opposite of major or powerful. Nor is C, seconds. This is a trap answer. If you didn't read the lines in the passage, you might think that minute was referring to a unit of time. Choice D is the opposite of what you're looking for because noticeable is somewhat similar to major. 33. D. This is a paraphrase question. Remember to trim the fat. Hormones have effects that are less urgent but can be far-reaching and difficult to track. They modify moods and affect human behavior. The basic idea is that hormones can have a strong effect on human behavior. So use PO. Eliminate A because it has the wrong subject. The sentence is not about moods and behavior. It's about hormones. Choice B also wrongly focuses on Scientists, when it should focus on hormones. Choice C introduces psychological damage, which is not part of the original sentence. Thus, D is the best choice. 34. The answer to this question is in the following lines. Some proponents of HRT have underscored their enthusiasm in the face of this new evidence, recommending it only to patients whose symptoms interfere with their abilities to live normal lives. 570 Cracking the TOEFL IBT. If the proponents now recommend HRT only to a small group of patients, their enthusiasm for it must have decreased. This makes A the best choice. Here's why the other choices are incorrect. There is no mention of advertising, so B is wrong. And the shaded word refers to enthusiasm, not HRT, so C and D make no sense. 35. D. To answer this question, you need to look at the final paragraph. It states, because of the complicated effects the growth hormone has on the body, such treatments are generally restricted to children who would be pathologically small in stature without it. Now use PO. Because the treatment is for children, eliminate A and B, which pertain to adults only. And eliminate C because it contradicts the passage, which states that the treatment is risky no matter who the patient is. Thus, D is correct. 36. This question asks you to find the purpose of hormone therapy. Here are the choices. The quantities and proportions of hormones produced change with age, so scientists have given a great deal of study to shifts in the endocrine system over time in the hopes of alleviating ailments associated with aging. This is the correct answer because the purpose is to alleviate ailments associated with aging. Here's why the other choices are incorrect. A combination of estrogen and progesterone has been prescribed for decades to women who want to reduce mood swings, sudden changes in body temperature, and other discomforts caused by lower natural levels of those hormones as they enter middle age. This answer is incorrect because it refers to a specific type of hormone treatment, estrogen and progesterone, not the overall purpose of the therapy. HRT may also increase the likelihood that blood clots, dangerous because they could travel through the bloodstream and block major blood vessels, will form. This answer also refers to only one type of hormone. Furthermore, it describes the problems with it, again, not the purpose of hormone therapy. Because of the complicated effects growth hormone has on the body, such treatments are generally restricted to children who would be pathologically small in stature without it. This answer is incorrect because it refers to a specific type of hormone treatment, estrogen and progesterone, not the overall purpose of the therapy. HRT may also increase the likelihood that blood clots, dangerous because they could travel through the bloodstream and block major blood vessels, will form. This answer also refers to only one type of hormone. Furthermore, it describes the problems with it, again, not the purpose of hormone therapy. Because of the complicated effects growth hormone has on the body, such treatments are generally restricted to children who would be pathologically small in stature without it. This answer also talks about problems with the therapy, again, rather than the purpose of hormone. 21. Practice test answers and explanations 571-37. See, this sentence should be inserted here. Known as hormone replacement therapy (HRT), the treatment was also believed to prevent weakening of the bones. The body is a complex machine, however, and recent studies have called into question the wisdom of essentially trying to fool its systems into believing they aren't aging. At least one study has linked HRT with a heightened risk of heart disease and certain types of cancer. This is the best place because the new sentence talks about recent studies, which are mentioned in the next sentence. It also uses the word however to indicate a transition from the first sentence, which discusses a positive aspect of the treatment, to the other sentence, which mentions a negative. 38. This passage focuses on the discovery of hormones, what they do, and what new medical techniques may result from them. This corresponds to the following correct answers. The class of chemicals called hormones was discovered by two researchers studying a substance produced in the small intestine. Scientists have discovered that not only the nervous system but also certain chemicals can affect bodily processes far from their points of origin. Hormones can affect not only life processes such as growth but also behavior and emotion. Researchers are looking for ways to decrease the dangers of treatments with growth hormone so that more patients can benefit from it. Here's why the other choices are incorrect. The first wrong answer is, the term hormone is based on a Greek word that means, to excite, or, to set in motion. This choice is wrong because it details only the origin of the word. It has nothing to do with hormones or how they work. Hormones can be given artificially, but such treatments have risks and must be used carefully, is wrong because it is too specific. It mentions hormone treatment, but it focuses on the risks. Hormone replacement therapy (HRT) may increase the risk of blood clots and heart disease in middle-aged women, is wrong because it mentions problems for only one small group of people, a detail that doesn't belong in the main idea. The listening section. Listening 1. Here is a transcript of the conversation track 24 on the accompanying CD and in your student tools. Pay attention to the structure and main idea purpose. N. Listen to part of a conversation at a university library. M. Hi, may I speak to the archives librarian? IV. I'm the archives librarian. What can I help you with? M. Well, actually, I'm not a student here. I'm studying history at State U. Across town, but there's a collection of IV. Oh, wait. Are you that? Sorry, I don't remember your name, but the librarian over there asked me about giving someone access to the Jacobson collection. Is that you? M. Yes, that's right. C. My paper is on the development of the coal mining industry here in the city, and the Jacobson collection has a lot of information about John Jacobson. Like, when he founded the company and things, right? IV. Yes, it does. More than you'll be able to fit into a paper, I bet. Did your librarian explain what our system is here? M. A little. She told me to make sure I brought my college ID so I could get in the door. IV. Yes, well, I'll need to take a copy of it too. Even our own students who look at items from our archive collections have to leave a copy of their ID with us. You'll also have to sign into the archives room whenever you enter and sign out whenever you leave. There's a desk, you know, for security. M. Wow, so a lot of this stuff is valuable. IV. Well, one don't know whether you'd get much money for it, but a lot of it is one of a kind, so if it were taken. That's it. It'd be gone. M. I'll be careful. IV. Thank you. The other thing is, the things in the Jacobson collection are more than 100 years old, so I'll have to ask you to wear special gloves while handling the books. Also, I'm afraid you won't be able to photocopy anything. M. I figured that. I ought to. I mean, I can probably get everything I need on note cards, but suppose there's a page or two I really want a copy of. Can I don't know, take a picture, or something? 21. Practice test answers and explanations 573W. Well, I can't let you take a picture. But we have scans, images, of all the pages in the collection. You can buy a print of any page you want, but they're expensive, $5 a piece. So be sure you know which pages you want before you ask for them. M. $5. Well, I guess given how rare these things are. Okay, so you want a copy of my ID, and then can you tell me how to get to the archives room so I can get started? 1. B. The man states the topic of his paper in his third statement. Here's why the other choices are incorrect. If you were unsure and had to guess, A would be a good choice to avoid because it is a trap. The student needs to use old books for his paper, but the paper isn't about old books. Eliminate C and D. These two subjects were not mentioned at all in the discussion. 2. B. The librarian tells the man, I'll need to take a copy of it, it equals his ID. At the end of the conversation, she tells him he'll have to sign in and out of the archives room. Here's why the other choices are incorrect. Choice A is incorrect because the woman never said that the man has to show her his notes. The $5 fee was for copying images, not entering the room, which is why C is incorrect. 3. C. The librarian says, a lot of it is one of a kind, so if it were taken. That's it. It'd be gone. It equals archival material. Here's why the other choices are incorrect. Choice B is the opposite of what the woman said. Well, I don't know if you'd get much money for it. Choices A and D were not mentioned in the conversation. 4. The librarian mentions the age of the books to explain why the student needs to wear gloves to handle them. Here's why the other choices are incorrect. Eliminate B because it is extreme. It says that the man can only look at photographs, whereas he can actually buy a print of any page he wants. Choice C, again, is the opposite of what the woman said about the value of the books. See the explanation for question 3. Choice C is incorrect because the passage does not mention when the books were added to the collection. 5. B. This question asks you to listen again to the following part of the conversation and to determine what the man meant in part of it highlighted below. W. Well, I can't let you take a picture. But we have scans, images, of all the pages in the collection. You can buy a print of any page you want, but they're expensive, $5 a piece. So be sure you know which pages you want before you ask for them. M. $5. Well, I guess given how rare these things are. Choice B is correct because the man admits. Given how rare these things are. Here's why the other choices are incorrect. Eliminate A and C because they have nothing to do with money. Choice D is not mentioned by the man. 574 Cracking the TOEFL IBT Listening to. Here is a transcript of the lecture track 25 on the accompanying CD and in your student tools. N. Listen to a professor lecture on the process of memory. P. A popular saying goes, an elephant never forgets. But how about people? Have you ever forgotten the name of someone you just met at a party? Sure, we all have. This is because our memories are complex processes. We're not going to be able to talk much about the physiology of memory here. Both because, well, it's not our subject, and because there's a lot we still need to learn about how the brain stores things. One thing we do know is that the mechanism isn't simple. When researchers scan the brain as a memory is forming, parts seem to light up. By light up, I mean, become active, in random, scattered formations. But of course they can't be random because memory produces very orderly results. One researcher, this is Walter Freeman of the University of California at Berkeley, compares it to two kinds of crowds. The impulses in the brain look completely random, like the movement of a mob of people who are frightened. They just keep moving, and they're not really going anywhere, and there's no pattern to their movement. That's the way impulses in the brain look at first. But since memory does, in fact, work, the impulses must be moving more like people in a crowded train station. If you've got people running in and out and from one train line to another, it seems like complete confusion. But really they all know where they're going. They're following a set of instructions, the timetable for the trains, the board that tells which track is for which train, all that stuff. So you have to look carefully to see that there's actually organization, a system, involved. That's how memory impulses must function. Freeman figures we just haven't figured out what the timetable and track numbers are. So we'll leave the physiology there. We're going to talk about the psychology of memory. The actual process. Psychologists divide memory into 3 stages: registration, long-term retention, and recall. In the initial stage, registration, information is perceived and understood, like when you first hear a name or address. This information is then retained in the short-term memory system. Unfortunately, the short-term memory is limited in the amount of material it can store at one time. And, unless refreshed by constant repetition, the new contents are lost within minutes when replaced by even newer information. To solve this dilemma, the information needs to be transformed into the second stage, long-term retention. The conversion to the long-term retention stage is most easily accomplished using what the research team labeled association. Associating the new information with the visual imagery evoked by it gives the individual a sort of memory crutch to rely on. For example, let's say you're at a party, and you've just met a woman named Lily. To remember her name, visualize it in connection to the flower, the lily. Oh, and be sure to make it outlandish. Kind of silly, even. Those images are most memorable. Picture her with a big basket of lilies, or wearing a hat with a lily on it, or even sitting inside a giant lily. 21. Practice test answers and explanations. 575 The third stage, recall, is when the information stored through long-term retention, at an unconscious level is then deliberately brought into the conscious mind. However, this final stage primarily depends on how well the material was stored in stage 2. Of course, there are disturbances that may affect the recall stage, age, for example. The older a person gets, the less new information he can recall. Disuse is another example. Here, forgetting occurs because stored information is not used and, therefore, is lost. Memory loss can also be physiological. If a person receives an injury to the head, he may experience what is known as amnesia, the failure to remember certain or even all events preceding the accident. Of course, many self-help books on how to improve your memory have been published, and many other mnemonic methods have been tried and tested. Let's take a closer look at some of the more widely accepted approaches to memory enhancement. Perhaps you may even incorporate some of them into your study habits as you prepare for the upcoming finals. 6. B. Here's why the other choices are incorrect. Choice A wrongly focuses on events instead of memory. Choice C is also a good candidate for PO because animals are not the main focus. Eliminate D because the professor doesn't mention this topic of how to strengthen memory until the very end of the lecture. 7. C. Here's why the other choices are incorrect. You may have recalled that the information in A doesn't appear until later in the lecture. For this question, B is not related to the main idea, so eliminate it. This idea of direction was used only in the crowded train station analogy. Choice D is extreme. It says that each person has a unique way of remembering things. 8. B. This is a question in which there isn't much you can do if you miss the part of the lecture that gives the definition. The 3 stages, registration, long-term retention, and recall, were first introduced. Then each stage was discussed in detail. If you did miss this, just guess and move on. 9. This question asks you to listen again to the following part of the lecture. For example, let's say you've just met a woman named Lily. To remember her name, visualize it in connection to the flower, the lily. Oh, and be sure to make it outlandish. Kind of silly, even. Those images are most memorable. Picture her with a big basket of lilies, or wearing a hat with a lily on it, or even sitting inside a giant lily. Here's why the other choices are incorrect. Choice B is extreme. Eliminate it. The lily example was exactly that, an example, not a recommendation of how to help one's memory by thinking of something from nature. Choice C wrongly focuses on the specifies of the example rather than the point of the professor's illustration. Choice D, which refers to the size of objects, has nothing to do with remembering a person's name. 576 Cracking the TOEFL IBT 10. B. Toward the end of the lecture, the professor talks about the disturbances that may affect the recall of stored memories. He says, disuse. Here forgetting occurs because stored information is not used and, therefore, is lost, which supports B. Here's why the other choices are incorrect. Choices A and C are not mentioned by the professor. Note that brain injury, the topic of C, is mentioned, but only in the context of amnesia. Choice D is the opposite of what is stated in the lecture. The older a person gets, the less new information he or she can recall. 11. D. The professor ends the lecture with these words. Let's take a closer look at some of the more widely accepted approaches to memory enhancement. Perhaps you may even incorporate some of them into your study habits as you prepare for the upcoming finals. Here's why the other choices are incorrect. Choices A and C are not mentioned. Eliminate B because it has nothing to do with the main idea. Listening 3. Here is a transcript of the class discussion, track 26 on the accompanying CD and in your student tools. N. Listen to part of a class discussion on the different types of joints. P. Now, I know that most of you are healthy individuals who participate in some sort of physical activity pretty regularly. Some of you jog, others bicycle, you might throw around the frisbee with your friends, or rollerblade. Our movements are so easy and fluid that you may not have stopped to think that the system of joints that makes them possible is highly complex. A joint is the place where 2 or more bones connect, and because that's the technical definition, it actually includes some places that don't move. Since it's movement that we're interested in, I won't spend much time on the immovable joints. They're called fibrous joints. The reason is that, well, they're joined together by bone fibers. It's kind of like welding or soldering 2 pieces of metal together. There are fibrous joints, for example, between the different bones that make up the top part of your skull. The bones don't move, right? I'm talking about the top of your head. Forget your jaw for a second. If your jaw had a fibrous joint, you couldn't talk. The round dome of the skull is made of several bone plates with fibers holding them together. Okay, so those are the fibrous joints. The other joints, the ones we're interested in, are movable. In a movable joint, the bones aren't fused to each other. They're held together with ligaments. Ligaments are long and flexible. They're kind of like ropes or cables. But because the bones have to slide or rub over each other when the joint moves, it also needs to be cushioned against abrasion. These joints are categorized by the types of tissues used to keep them working smoothly. Cartilaginous joints have a tough, smooth lining over the parts of the bone. It's like a pad or cushion. It protects the bone from friction that could wear it down or cause it to splinter. And, in fact, if this cartilage, the protective tissue is called cartilage, if 21. Practice test answers and explanations 577 It becomes worn or damaged, joint movement may be painful or severely restricted because now you have bone hitting bone. That's because cartilaginous joints are tight. The bones fit very closely together, for example, the bones in your spine. Some joints require more movement. They're called synovial joints. There has to be a space between the bones, a joint cavity. Those more mobile joints, in addition to being padded with cartilage, are lubricated with liquid that flows through the cavity. The knuckles of your fingers are examples of synovial joints. Of course, the fluid has to be held in place, otherwise it'll seep into the surrounding tissues and be absorbed back into the body, and what holds it in place is a little membrane-lined sac called a bursa. So the joint is encased in this membrane, and the membrane is a pocket for that lubricating fluid. By the way, the fluid also keeps the joint nourished. It doesn't have an independent blood supply in adults, so the fluid absorbs nutrients from the blood through the joint's outer membrane. That's a synovial joint. Tony, do you have a question? Yeah, I'm kind of confused. When we learned about the joints in high school, I don't remember talking about them this way. I thought we talked about them more like machines. Like, the directions in which they move. We're getting to that. Okay, now that we have joints categorized by how their surfaces are put together, fibrous, synovial, and cartilaginous, we can talk about how the movable joints actually move. I mentioned your knuckles a few minutes ago, and they're good examples of hinge joints. They work kind of like the hinge on a door, so the joint can flex and extend in one direction only. But hinge joints aren't the only movable joints in the body. The hip, as well as the shoulder, is an example of the ball and socket joint. The ball and socket joint allows the greatest range of movement, and therefore, it has to be the most anatomically complex. In a ball and socket, one bone has a rounded knob at the end, and it fits snugly into the socket, a round cavity, of another bone. The ball and socket joint is a type characteristically found in more evolved creatures, such as apes and us humans. It allows you to move through 360 degrees of motion, the way you can wind your arm back before you throw a ball. While we're at it, can anyone think of another type of joint? Well, I know that when I rollerblade, I have to turn my head constantly to make sure I don't crash into anyone. But the neck doesn't seem to be an example of either a hinge joint or a ball and socket joint. Good example, Louise. The neck is actually a type of pivot joint. Pivot joints permit rotation, the way you can twist your head around. Well, it doesn't go all the way around, but it moves around your neck. It pivots on an axis. 12. See, here's why the other choices are incorrect. There is no mention of injuries, so A is wrong. Eliminate B because sports are mentioned only at the very beginning of the lecture, as a way of introducing the main topic. Flexibility, D is not mentioned either. 578 Cracking the TOEFL IBT 13. Here's why the other choices are incorrect. Choice B regarding ligaments pertains to the other type of joint, movable joints, not fibrous joints. Off choices, C is the best candidate for PO. The entire lecture talked about humans, so it wouldn't make sense for C to be correct. You can also eliminate D because of the word most. 14. See, this question asks you to listen again to the following part of the discussion. There are fibrous joints, for example, between the different bones that make up the top part of your skull. The bones don't move, right? I'm talking about the top of your head, forget your jaw for a second. If your jaw had a fibrous joint, you couldn't talk. Here's why the other choices are incorrect. Choice B is extreme. It uses the word best. Choice D is a good trap because the instructor said, forget your jaw. However, if you're unsure of the correct answer and one choice seems too easy, it's probably a trap. 15. B. This is a question in which PO doesn't help much. If you didn't quite catch the part of the lecture, take your best guess and move on. If you remember that shoulders and hips are the same type of joint, you can eliminate both of them because you can choose only one answer. 16. D. The professor stated this at the end of the lecture. Here's why the other choices are incorrect. Cartilage was mentioned earlier in the talk, so eliminate A. Eliminate B because it is too strong. It is unlikely that the joint cannot be damaged at all. Eliminate C because the professor never says that ball and socket joints need to move quickly. He says they allow for the greatest range of motion. 17. This one's tough. The completed chart is shown below. Synovial cartilaginous. A special liquid lubricates and nourishes the joint. X. There is no cavity between the bones. X. The joint is covered with a membrane-lined sac. X. Only a lining of smooth tissue protects the bones. X. The joint has limited movement. X. 21. Practice test answers and explanations 579 Listening 4 Here is a transcript of the class discussion, track 27 on the accompanying CD and in your student tools. N. Listen to part of a discussion in a class on English literature. P. Everyone here. Okay, I hope that you all did the readings for this week. I know it's midterm time, and you're all busy, but Robert Browning is one of the most important poets in the history of English literature. He deserves all your attention. Actually, it's usually not hard to sell Browning on my students. I find his poetry really draws people in. So, what did you all think? IB. Well, you're certainly right that it draws you in, but I have to say, it really confused me at first. P. What was it that confused you? IB. Well, I mean, the poems we've read so far have been, it's like, the poet is just kind of writing the poem. The poems we read by this Browning guy. It took me a few minutes to realize that he was using the voice of some historical character. It was supposed to be someone else speaking. P. Sure. The reason I assigned this particular set of poems by Browning was so you could see what his most famous style was. He perfected a style called the dramatic monologue. And its major features are what you saw in the readings. It's called dramatic because a poem of this type takes place at some sort of dramatic moment in the middle of a story. And a monologue is a long speech given by an individual, right? And so are these poems. You have Browning writing as if he were a different person, usually someone from history, speaking at length. And he talks about something that's happening to him when the poem takes place. Professor, I kind of cheated and looked up information about Browning when I did the readings. I was like Karen. I was really confused at first. It seems strange that this form of poetry, you know, the dramatic monologue, is so new. Browning only lived in the 19th century. Was he really the first person to develop a kind of poetry where he pretended to be someone from history giving a speech? It surprised me to read that. P. Well, you see, the dramatic monologue is actually a more complex style of poetry than it might seem to be at first. For one thing, a lot of poems are addressed to the world in general, sort of. But a dramatic monologue isn't. The speaker in a dramatic monologue is addressing a particular person involved in the story. So for example in the poem, My Last Duchess, the Duke is doing the speaking. And he's specifically speaking to a servant of his future father-in-law. That's important. A lot of the poem doesn't make sense unless you bear in mind that he's trying to give a message to the father of his new wife. IB. It took me a while to figure that out. And then, when I realized what was going on, it really creeped me out. I mean, did I read it right? He seemed to be admitting. 580 Cracking the TOEFL IBTP. Karen, why don't we hold off on analyzing the poem too much for right now? I don't want to shut you down, but I do want to stick to the general structure of the poems for a bit. I will say that when Karen talks about finding the poem a little spooky, part of that probably comes from the fact that, well, you figure, within the poem, the speaker is talking to someone in particular. So when you read the poem, you kind of take that person's role, the role of the person being addressed. That's one chief characteristic of the dramatic monologue. Now, obviously, the other thing Karen was probably unsettled by, in the case of My Last Duchess, is that the Duke doesn't sound like a very nice character. We know that because of another key element of the dramatic monologue. What the speaker says is designed to make an argument, he's trying to persuade the listener. And you the reader by extension. That what he did was right, or that his viewpoint is correct, or whatever. He makes a case, kind of like a lawyer with a judge or jury, and in the process he reveals his way of thinking, something of his psychology. And you have to decide whether you believe him. It's kind of hard because, I felt like a lot of the story was missing. The speaker in the poem only told his side of things, and you got the feeling that there had to be more going on, but it was all just guesswork. P. Now you see why I said the form was complex, huh? Sure, you have to fill in the backstory yourself. And that's the third big characteristic of a dramatic monologue. Now, with those things in mind, let's look at the actual poems you read for this week. 18. C. Dramatic monologue was emphasized by the professor early in the lecture. Here's why the other choices are incorrect. Choice A is wrong because the discussion is about Browning, not what influenced him. Choice B is too broad. Make sure your choice reflects the topic of the discussion. Eliminate D because the professor doesn't mention My Last Duchess until halfway through the lecture. 19. D. This question asks you to listen again to the following part of the discussion and to determine what the professor meant in part of it. Okay, I hope that you all did the readings for this week. I know it's midterm time, and you're all busy, but Robert Browning is one of the most important poets in the history of English literature. He deserves all your attention. Actually, it's usually not hard to sell Browning on my students. I find his poetry really draws people in. Here's why the other choices are incorrect. Choices A and B don't make sense. The professor stated that Browning is very popular. Choice C is pretty much contradicted by the fact that both students say they were confused, and the professor says the dramatic monologue is actually a more complex emphasis-added style of poetry, and thus, not easy to understand. 21. Practice test answers and explanations 581-20. The professor says, a monologue is a long speech given by an individual, right? Here's why the other choices are incorrect. The discussion is all about poems and people, not historical characters, B, or events, C. For this question, D is obviously out because a monologue is not a person. 21. A, B, D. Choice C is not mentioned. Although My Last Duchess may be about a duke, it doesn't mean that all poems of this sort are about people of high status. 22. B. The student says, when I realized what was going on, it really creeped me out. Here's why the other choices are incorrect. Choice A is the opposite of what the woman felt. Choice C should be eliminated because no other poems are mentioned. The woman says she had trouble realizing that Browning was using the voice of some historical character. She never questions the historical accuracy of the poem. Eliminate D. 23. C. This question asks you to listen again to the following part of the discussion. W. It took me a while to figure that out. And then, when I realized what was going on, it really creeped me out. I mean, did I read it right? He seemed to be admitting. P. Karen, why don't we hold off on analyzing the poem too much for right now? I don't want to shut you down, but I do want to stick to the general structure of the poems for a bit. The professor said, why don't we hold off on analyzing the poem too much for right now, meaning that he didn't want to talk about the specifics. Here's why the other choices are incorrect. Choice D is the opposite meaning of the sentence above. Choices A and B also invite further discussion, which is not what the professor is doing at this point. 582 Cracking the TOEFL IBT Listening 5. Here is a transcript of the conversation, track 28 on the accompanying CD and in your student tools. N. Listen to a conversation on a college campus. M. Amy, a bunch of us are probably going to ditch the dining hall and go for pizza tonight. If you're free, you can meet us at the East Gate at 7. HC. You know, I'd love to, but I have tutoring tonight. M. Tutoring. I can't imagine you needing help with a class. IB. The tutoring I'm talking about is tutoring I'm doing for someone else, though, now that you mention it, physics has been giving me more problems than usual this semester. M. I find that hard to believe. So are you tutoring one of the lower classmen, or something? IB. Actually, no, I go downtown to tutor a few students at the high school. M. High school kids. Wow, in math or something? IB. Right. You've probably read about this in the paper, but the city's trying to raise the standards for its math classes. The problem is, a lot of the kids are behind when they get to junior high school. M. So you help them get caught up. IB. Basically, I have free students for 45 minutes each on Wednesday night. So I'm there from 6 o'clock to 8:30 or so. M. Isn't that late for kids to be still at school? IB. Well, they'd be doing homework at that hour if they were home, anyway. The thing is, most of the tutors are students here at the university, so our classes aren't over until late afternoon. And the city education department likes us. We're good at what we do, but we volunteer, so the program doesn't cost a lot beyond, you know, the heat and electricity to keep the high school open at night. M. Can you afford to take that much time away from your own studying? IB. Some weeks it's kind of hard, but, I mean, when I go to grad school, I'm going to have to start teaching physics to students as a professor's assistant anyway. I may as well get used to teaching with easier material and just one student at a time. M. And it must be nice to help people. IV. Definitely. That goes without saying. 45 minutes a week isn't much time, but all 3 of my students have improved in the months we've worked together. It's really inspiring. 21. Practice test answers and explanations 583 M. Cool. W. So, anyway, sorry about dinner. It sounds like fun, and if it were any other night. M. Hey, I understand. Have fun, and I guess I'll see you in class tomorrow morning. 24. D. This is the main idea of the conversation, helping high school students with their studies. The other choices are not part of the conversation. 25. C. This question asks you to listen again to the following part of the conversation and to determine what the woman meant in part of it. M. Tutoring. I can't imagine you needing help with a class. W. The tutoring I'm talking about is tutoring I'm doing for someone else, though, now that you mention it, physics has been giving me more problems than usual this semester. The woman says, physics has been giving me more problems than usual this semester. Therefore, the correct answer is C. Here's why the other choices are incorrect. Choice A isn't correct because the only mention of physics is the general comment that the class is giving her problems. There's no specific mention about any particular assignment. Choice B doesn't make sense because she wouldn't have problems with physics if she weren't taking it. She is not referring to the man, so eliminate D. 26. Here's the statement from the conversation. The city's trying to raise the standards for its math classes. Here's why the other choices are incorrect. Choice B is the opposite of what the woman states about the program. She says it doesn't have a lot of money. Choice C doesn't answer the question of why the program was started. Choice D doesn't work because there's no mention that the university students initiated or suggested the tutoring, just that they're doing it. 27. D. Here's the statement from the conversation. The city education department likes us. We're good at what we do, but we volunteer, so the program doesn't cost a lot. Here's why the other choices are incorrect. Eliminate A and C because of the word most, which is an extreme word. Remember to avoid these. Choice B is the opposite of what the woman says, she tutors at night. 28. B. Here's the statement from the conversation. When I go to grad school, I'm going to have to start teaching physics to students. Anyway, I may as well get used to teaching. Here's why the other choices are incorrect. Choice A doesn't make sense. The woman is not being tutored. Instead, she is tutoring other students. The jobs mentioned in C and D are not mentioned by the woman. She mentions only her future teaching duties as a grad student. 584 Cracking the TOEFL IBT Listening 6. Here is a transcript of the lecture track 29 on the accompanying CD and in your student tools. N. Listen to part of a lecture on events leading up to the American Revolution. P. Okay, while I think of it, on Tuesday, I was originally going to show you a documentary film about a town in New England that was founded in the colonial period. But it looks like we had a mix-up at the library, and they lent it out to someone, so I won't be able to show it until Thursday's class. So, instead of what I told you before, do the readings over the weekend and be prepared to discuss them on Tuesday. Hope that doesn't inconvenience you. Okay, we're going to be talking about the American Revolution, what we often call the Revolutionary War, and we'll talk about 2 or 3 laws, the Sugar Act, the Currency Act, and the Stamp Act. They were all enacted soon after the French and Indian War ended in 1763. The British had won the war and, as a consequence, gained a lot of territory. But there was a downside to their victory. The war had cost a lot of money. So, British Parliament looked for ways to make sure that trade money from the American colonies came back to Britain. The increased money would help pay for the war. The way the British decided to get that money was to put taxes on certain purchases and to put limits on what kinds of goods the colonists could buy and sell, and that's where the trouble started. The Sugar Act was passed in 1764. It was actually a revised version of an old tax on sugar byproducts like molasses, and it had 2 big effects. 1. Parliament lowered the tax on molasses but increased the tax on sugar and certain kinds of cloth, coffee, some wines, and fruits from the tropics. Second, it made sure the taxes were collected. The old tax on molasses hadn't been enforced very well. Now, what this did was, mostly, it made it more difficult for rich people. They were the ones buying the wines and tropical fruits and refined sugar, as you might imagine, to get things they wanted. Now, that same year, Parliament passed the Currency Act. The colonists had to buy most of their goods from home, from England. That took up most of their British currency. So, what happened, of course, was that when they wanted to trade with each other within the colonies, they didn't have any money left over to use. That gave them an incentive to come up with their own paper currency. Some was backed by meaning, its value was based on people's property. It was useless for buying things from England, but it was very useful for workers with a little farmland who wanted to pay off their debts quickly. They could use the paper notes and then try to earn back the real value in produce from their farms. What did the Currency Act do? It invalidated all these colonial forms of paper currency. The colonists were told they couldn't use them anymore. So now you have the rich merchants, the traders, angered by the Sugar Act, and you have the laborers in debt who need to rely on paper money, and they're angered by the Currency Act. Okay, so now the third law, the Stamp Act. The Sugar Act put a tax on sugar, so you might think the Stamp Act put a tax on stamps, but that wasn't the idea. The idea was that there would now be a tax on all sorts of official documents the colonists used to. 21. Practice test answers and explanations 585 get for free. Marriage licenses, newspapers, even playing cards. Well, these were the kinds of things people needed for everyday life, so everyone, merchants and laborers alike, was outraged. Now, I'm leaving out some things in the sequence of events, such as that the British government adjusted some of the provisions of these laws when the colonists complained. But the main point I'm trying to make is, these laws were meant to get more money, more revenue, for the British government to pay for the French and Indian War, but the effect they had on the colonists was to make them feel as if they were being pushed around by a bunch of people in Parliament on the other side of the ocean. Up until this point, the taxes in the colonies had been administered by local governments in the colonies themselves. For the first time, Britain not only imposed taxes on the colonists but showed that it would use force to collect them. And this was the origin of the famous slogan, taxation without representation, and it stoked the movement among the colonists to be free of British rule. 29. D. Here's why the other choices are incorrect. Choice A is not related to the main idea. Choice B is far too broad. No mention is made of C. 30. D. This question asks you to listen again to the following part of the lecture. P. Okay, while I think of it, on Tuesday, I was originally going to show you a documentary film about a town in New England that was founded in the colonial period. But it looks like we had a mix-up at the library, and they lent it out to someone, so I won't be able to show it until Thursday's class. So instead of what I told you before, do the readings over the weekend and be prepared to discuss them on Tuesday. Hope that doesn't inconvenience you. Choice D is the answer. The other choices are not correct because they are not mentioned at all. 31. This information is given in the professor's introduction. The tax acts described in the rest of the lecture were all enacted soon after the French and Indian War ended in 1763. The war had cost a lot of money. Here's why the other choices are incorrect. Choices B and C are related to the actual taxes, but they do not answer the question of why the British needed money. Choice D is incorrect because there's no mention of taxes in Britain, only in the American colonies. 32. A, B. Here's why the other choices are incorrect. Choice C is a little tricky because the lecture does say that the Sugar Act was a revised version of an old tax on sugar byproducts, emphasis added, and it does mention taxes on coffee and wines, but not that they were replaced. Instead, it says the Sugar Act increased the tax on sugar and coffee, some wines. Again, emphasis added. Off choices, D is the best candidate for Poe because it contradicts the main idea of the lecture, which is that there were too many taxes on the colonists. 586 Cracking the TOEFL IBT 33. B. Here's the statement in the lecture. The colonists had to buy most of their goods from home, from England. That took up most of their British currency. Therefore, B is the correct answer. Here's why the other choices are incorrect. Eliminate A because although the colonists did need more money to pay the higher sugar tax, this is not the reason they developed their own paper currency. Instead, the reason is that they wanted to trade with each other within the colonies, and they didn't have any money, i.e., British currency, left over to use. That gave them an incentive to come up with their own paper currency. Eliminate C because it is extreme. There is no mention of D in the lecture. 34. C. Here's why the other choices are incorrect. Choice A is wrong because newspapers are mentioned, but only because the Stamp Act taxed them and other official documents. Outlawing them isn't mentioned at all. Also, eliminate B because the war was mentioned in a different part of the lecture. Choice D refers to the wrong act, so eliminate it. The speaking section. Sample responses. Compare your responses with the samples below. All the samples are of high-scoring responses. Try to copy the style and structure of the sample responses. Even if you feel you have a strong answer, practice saying our sample answers out loud to give yourself ideas of different ways of answering the same question. Speaking 1. Describe an academic subject that interests you, and explain why you find the subject interesting. Include details and examples to support your explanation. Here's one way you could have answered this question. State personal preference. One of my favorite subjects is biology. I find it interesting for many reasons. Reason number 1. The first reason I find biology interesting is that I enjoy working with living things. Specific detail for reason number 1. Studying biology gives me the opportunity to work with plants, insects, and different kinds of animals. Reason number 2. Another reason I find biology interesting is the strange facts I have discovered. Specific detail for reason number 2. For example, there are some animals that have no mouths and some that live for only one day. Reason number 3. Finally, I find biology interesting because I will need it for my future career. Specific detail for reason number 3. I hope one day to be a doctor, and biology will be very useful to me. 21. Practice test answers and explanations. 587. Speaking to narrator. Some universities have large, lecture-based classes, while others have smaller, discussion-based classes. Which do you think is better and why? Include details and reasons to support your position. Here's one way you could have answered this question. State opinion. I believe that small classes are better than larger ones. Reason number 1. I think it is important for students to be able to talk about ideas. Specific detail for reason number 1. If you are in a large class, you will not be heard and will not be able to interact with the teacher. Reason number 2. Also, a small class is better because the student will get to know the professor. Specific detail for reason number 2. The student will have a better experience if he or she knows the professor well. The student will get more out of the class. Reason number 3. Finally, one prefers small classes because they are more interesting. Specific detail for reason number 3. It is easy to become distracted or lost during a lecture. But during a talk, you are more involved. Speaking 3. Here is a transcript of the passage track 30 on the accompanying CD and in your student tools. Narrator. Now read the passage about birds of prey. You have 45 seconds to read the passage. Begin reading now. Birds of prey. Many people assume that raptor is the word properly used to designate all birds of prey. In fact, raptors are a group with 3 basic traits that many flesh-eating birds do not share. First, a raptor has strong feet and claws that it uses to capture prey. Second, a raptor has well-developed eyesight. This facilitates hunting from the air. Finally, a raptor has a hooked or curved beak for tearing flesh. And now listen to part of a lecture on this topic given in a biology class. There are 2 bird species found in our local area that I think do a good job of exemplifying the range of ways birds of prey can adapt. One is the bald eagle, and the other is the great blue heron. They both feed largely on fish, and they're both large. But the more closely you observe them, the more the differences show. 588. Cracking the TOEFL IBT. The bald eagle is always on the lookout for dead fish at the side of a river or lake, or for fish that it can grab from close to the surface of the water. That's because it has very sharp eyesight and strong talons. It can swoop down, grab a fish in its claws, and start eating it midair. Its beak curves. It has sort of a hook at the end so it can start pulling food into its mouth. The great blue heron might eat those same fish, but it would have to go about it differently. The heron does have good eyesight. It'd be hard to see prey otherwise, right? But its claws aren't as strong as the eagle's, so it usually attacks by diving into the water headfirst. The heron has a long, straight beak that it can use either like a spear to impale a fish or like tongs to grab it. The professor discussed the characteristics of 2 kinds of birds of prey. On the basis of these characteristics, explain whether either bird would be categorized as a raptor. Here's one way you could have answered this question. Main response. According to the reading, a raptor has several characteristics. The eagle is a raptor but the heron isn't. Characteristic number 1 from reading first, a raptor has claws on its feet. It uses its claws to capture food. Detail number 1 from lecture. The eagle mentioned in the lecture has these types of claws. However, the heron uses its beak to capture food. Characteristic number 2 from reading. Another quality of the raptor is strong eyesight. Its eyesight helps the bird hunt. Detail number 2 from lecture. The professor said that the eagle has strong eyesight. The heron does as well. Characteristic number 3 from reading. The last thing about a raptor is a hooked beak. Detail number 3 from lecture. The eagle has this, but the heron doesn't. Speaking 4. Here is a transcript of the discussion, track 31 on the accompanying CD and in your student tools. N. The College of Arts and Sciences at Eastern University has decided to add a senior project to its existing graduation requirements. The campus newspaper printed the following report about the announcement of the new requirement. You have 45 seconds to read the report. Begin reading now. The College of Arts and Sciences has announced that it will require students to write a senior thesis to qualify for graduation, beginning with students who enter the university this coming fall. The senior thesis is currently an option in all departments. Specific. 21. Practice test answers and explanations. 589 criteria have not yet been released by the dean, but they are expected to define the thesis as a year-long research project, undertaken with the guidance of a faculty advisor, that results in a paper of at least 50 pages or the equivalent. N. Now listen to 2 students as they discuss the report. W. Wow, look at this. The dean seems to be serious about tightening graduation requirements. They'll be forcing students to write a senior thesis in order to graduate. M. Yeah, you know, I read that at breakfast. It seems a little weird. W. Weird. Haven't you seen all those reports about how graduates with poor writing skills are having trouble finding jobs? Companies don't want to hire them. M. W. And the ones that want to apply to graduate school, if they can't write, they can't present their research ideas effectively in their essays. M. I guess I'm more thinking about the science people, biology, physics. I mean, it seems strange to give them this big paper to do. W. Maybe. On the other hand, the paper, see here. It says you have to write a paper, or equivalent. So presumably, you can do a project that ends up as a lot of data and stuff. Maybe make it a presentation instead of a paper. But even so, I mean, don't biologists have to learn how to write up their research in order to get it published? It seems to me that having a writing requirement is long overdue. N. The woman explains her opinion of the announcement made by the College of Arts and Sciences. State her opinion, and explain the reasons she gives for holding that opinion. Here's how you could have answered this question. State opinion. The woman states that the senior thesis is a good idea. Reason number 1. She thinks this is a good idea because students should know how to write. Detail for reason number 1. The woman says that companies don't want to hire people who are bad writers. Reason number 2. The woman so agrees with the idea because of graduate school. Detail for reason number 2. According to the woman, students need to write well in order to succeed in graduate school. 590J cracking the TOEFL IBT speaking 5. Here is a transcript of the conversation, track 32 on the accompanying CD and in your student tools. N. Now listen to a conversation between 2 students. IB. The walls of my dorm room are so thin, I can hear everything my neighbors do. M. Oh yeah, you live in one of the newer dorms, huh? IB. Yup. Their voices and music come right through, even when they're trying to be quiet. I really can't study there anymore. M. Well, it's the middle of the semester, and the housing office has some odd rooms no one's in. They'll let you move if you ask. IB. I guess. It'd be a big project. M. Yeah, but if it's affecting your ability to study, there must be somewhere quieter than your room now. IB. Right. M. Or what about studying at a quiet place in the library? IB. I know a lot of people do that. I've just always studied in my room because it's more convenient than dragging all my textbooks and notes and things across campus. M. Sure, but you also don't have your TV and stereo with you. I find it much less easy to get distracted when I use the library. IB. I can see that. M. Right. I find my work gets done much faster, and I remember what I've read better, when I study in the library. And the lighting's probably better for your eyes than the lamp in your room. N. The speakers discuss 2 possible solutions for the woman's problem. Describe the problem, then state which of the 2 solutions you prefer, and explain why. 21. Practice test answers and explanations 591. Here's how you may have answered this question. State the problem. The problem is that it is too loud in the student's room to study. State the solutions. The friend offers two solutions. One is to move, and the other is to study in the library. State your preference. I think the best option would be to study in the library. Reason number 1. The library is a good place to study because it is quiet. Detail for reason number 1. The student will not have to worry about music or loud conversations at the library. Reason number 2. I also think the library is better because the student won't be distracted there. Detail for reason number 2. It is very easy to focus on work when at the library. Speaking 6. Here is the transcript of the lecture, track 33 on the accompanying CD and in your student tools. N. Now listen to part of a lecture in a history class. P. The discovery of copper was a great advance for civilization, but no one is quite sure how it happened. Of course, in nature, metal like copper is usually buried in rock. Early humans must have accidentally discovered that heating the rock melted the metal and released it. There are two interesting ways that might have happened. One relates to the use of primitive campfires. Once humans figured out how to control fire for light and heat, they knew that they needed to keep their fires confined. One of the ways they did this was to take stones and cover the fire with them partially. That kept the fire enclosed, and it also made sure it didn't burn too fast and use up the fuel. Now, what do you think might have happened? Some of those stones contained copper, and before the fire died down, it was hot enough to melt the copper out of the stones. When people went back to the fire after it had burned out, they discovered small pieces of shiny metal that had melted out and cooled. There's a second possibility that relates to pottery. Early humans discovered how to make pottery before they learned how to use copper. Of course, to make pottery, you have to bake it in an oven, right? Well, some societies got into the habit of decorating their containers with colored stones before baking them. One of those stones is a mineral called malachite, and malachite contains. That's right, copper. The hot temperature inside the oven released the copper metal from the other ingredients. 592. Cracking the TOEFL IBT. When the people took their pottery out of the oven, they found pieces of copper at the bottom. N. Using points and examples from the top, explain the two possible ways early humans discovered how to use fire to release copper from solid rock. Here's how you may have answered this question. State main idea. The professor states that it was an accident that humans discovered copper. Reason number 1. Humans may have discovered copper by using campfires. Detail for reason number 1. Copper is stuck inside rocks, and people used rocks to contain their fires. Link between reason number 1 and main idea. If the fire was hot enough, the people would have noticed pieces of copper in their fires. Reason number 2. Another way people could have discovered copper was through pottery. Detail for reason number 2. Sometimes the people decorated their pottery with stones. Link between reason number 2 and main idea. The heat caused the copper to melt and come out of the stones, and the people could have discovered it that way. The writing section. Sample responses. Look over your written responses. Make sure they answer the question effectively, are of the appropriate length, and are well organized. Use the following responses as guides. Writing 1. Narrator. Now read the passage about the suppression of forest fires. You have 3 minutes to read the passage. Begin reading now. Wilderness management has advanced greatly over the last century, due in part to such practices as the suppression of forest fires and limitations on the clear-cutting of trees. Monitoring forests for small brush fires is easier with aircraft, as is the use of large amounts of water and sophisticated chemical fire extinguishers to prevent fires from spreading. The goals of decreasing the amount of destruction by fires and cutting are wide-ranging. One is simply the longer lives and improved health of trees. In some areas of hickory and oak forest on the eastern seaboard, fire suppression has allowed the maturation of so many trees that the treetops form a continuous canopy. 21. Practice test answers and explanations 593. There is evidence of the healthful effects of fire suppression closer to the ground as well. Vines and low bushes that would be burned out in a forest fire can flourish when fires are suppressed, of course, but there is a more indirect way fires harm plant life. Chemical tests on areas that have recently experienced forest fires demonstrate that burning decreases the overall amount of nutrients in the soil. Suppressing fires prevents such a decrease. Ferns, wildflowers, and herbs grow without disturbance. Finally, wildlife can benefit. In the eastern hickory and oak forests, the suppression of fires has meant that forest animals, ranging from small insects and birds to large deer and bears, are not burned to death. Deer populations, in particular, have increased notably. Here is a transcript of the lecture track 34 on the accompanying CD and in your student tools. And now listen to part of a lecture on the topic you just read about. For years, forest fires were regarded as uniformly destructive, and forest managers put a lot of effort into preventing them. But it turns out that fire suppression may have destructive long-term effects on the forests it's supposed to protect. For instance, mature oaks have grown so thickly in some places that little light reaches the forest floor. But young oak trees need light in order to grow properly. The lack of light has meant that new oaks aren't maturing rapidly enough to replace the older oaks. It also means that other tree species that don't need so much light, such as maples, are invading oak and hickory forests and competing for resources. There are competition problems at ground level too. What forest fires, both natural and artificial, used to do is burn off some of the plants on the forest floor before they could grow into huge thickets. Now they run wild over the ground, and again, that means it's hard for young trees and other native plants to grow. Then there's the increase in the deer population. This partially results from the lack of forest fires and partially from limitations on hunting, but the thing is, deer like to eat the leaves off oak saplings. So if one of those oak seedlings somehow does manage to get a good start, despite the shade and all the other plants competing for nutrients, it's likely to be killed by having its leaves eaten. Oh, and one other thing. Scientists are now finding that forest fires release nutrients from the plants and animals that are burned. That means that, even though the total amount of nutrients is decreased, there can actually be more nutrients available on the soil surface for plants that are trying to grow back afterward. And summarize the points made in the lecture you just heard, explaining how they challenge specific claims made in the reading passage. You may refer to the passage as you write. 594 Cracking the TOEFL IBT Sample High Scoring Response. In the lecture, the professor made several points about the effects of forest fires. The professor argues that forest fires can actually be good for the forests, not bad. The talk by the professor, however, is different from the reading. According to the reading, forest fires are harmful to the land and should be stopped. But the professor casts doubt on that view with several points. The first point the teacher makes is that if there are too many trees, it is hard for some trees to get light and nutrition. This means that the trees are not healthy. The professor's point is different from the reading. The reading states that it is good to have a lot of trees in the forest. But the lecture shows that too many trees is actually bad for the forest. Another point made by the professor is that burning a forest actually puts more nutrients into the land. This is not what the reading says. The reading says that fires take nutrients out of the soil. However, the professor says there are more nutrients at the top for plants to use. In conclusion, the professor challenges the claims made in the reading by showing that forest fires are sometimes needed for a healthy forest. Writing 2 directions. For this task, you will write an essay in which you state, explain, and support your position on an issue. You have 30 minutes to plan and write your essay. Question. Do you agree or disagree with the following statement? A university education should be provided free of charge to all interested scholars. Use examples and reasons to support your position. Sample high scoring response. The issue stated by the topic is whether or not a university education should be provided free to all that are interested. This is a very important issue because the cost of education is rising and because education is very important. However, I believe that universities should not give an education for free. I do not think that university education should be free because who is going to pay for it if the students do not? If the government has to pay for it, then that means taxes are raised. This is not fair to the people because if they have to pay higher taxes they might not want to go to the university. That means they are paying for something they won't even use, which is not fair. Furthermore, I don't think university education should be free because universities that have more money can give better education. The only way for the universities to get more money is to charge the students. If the education is free, how will the universities get money to buy computers, books, and hire good professors to teach? For this reason, we should not have a free university. 21. Practice test answers and explanations. 595. Finally, I think the university should not be free because there are many schools available and they have different prices. 4 students can go to a school that doesn't cost as much and still learn a lot. Also, many universities give aid or scholarships so a student can attend even if they don't have money. So there is no need to make a university education free. In conclusion, university education should not be made free. I believe this because the colleges need the money to make them better. If the universities are free, taxes will be raised and people will have to pay for things they might not use. Since there are many schools available with scholarships and aid, university should not be made free. In closing, okay, got all that. It's a lot, but if you have made it all the way back here, then you have pushed through it and done some serious studying and preparation. Bravo! Walk into the TOEFL feeling confident and prepared because you are. Best of luck. 596 cracking the TOEFL IBT.